Good. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm actually very, very honoured to be here. It's a bit scary. We were just sitting in the front saying how amazing it is that you've turned out on a rainy Monday night to listen to us. And I'm very grateful that somebody turns up. Nobody does. I'm a paediatric cardiac surgeon, so I started off looking after very tiny babies. And I want to today talk about a couple of innovations and then set you a challenge, because things are going to be hard. And as far as I'm concerned, I completely agree with Banksy that most things look better in a circle, and here's mine. The patient must always be at the centre of what you do. Otherwise, I can't see the point of getting up in the morning. It's pointless. You've joined medicine to look after people. I think you've actually joined to look after individuals. You can easily think about groups of patients, but it's the one that's in front of you that really matters. So the two bits that I'm going to talk about that are the innovations are a patient with a blind problem, a risky process, and then the challenge I'm going to set you is that I think you've all forgotten about customer focus, and that if we were a private sector industry of any kind, certainly in the retail world, would have shut down months ago, because we're not doing our customers a service. So here's my plumbing problem. This is Kieran, this little boy at the bottom. And he was born with long segment congenital tracheal stenosis. His airway was 1 millimetre across when he was born, and he couldn't breathe and was put immediately onto ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, so he cannulated his jugular and carotid and gave him a heart-lung machine by the bedside. And in those days, the treatment was to stick a little patch on there, and I used a pericardial patch because I'm a cardiac surgeon, it's easy, and I knew how to do that. He did quite well, but he needed a stent, and at about 6 months or 3 months of age, you can see the stent here. It blows up in the airway. 2 years later, one Friday night, his stent eroded out of his trachea and into his aorta, and for some amazing reason, his mother managed to resuscitate him. It's quite difficult. And I fixed it that night. I'll show you that in a minute. He needed a few more stents after that, and he did well for another 10 years until he bled again, and his stent, Mountford's arrived. He's always late, I told you. And at that stage, we wondered what we should do for him. Now, on the original Friday night, which was year 2000, I replaced the front wall of his trachea after taking the stent out with a thing called a tracheal homograft. You can see it on the left-hand panel. It looks like a lump of leather, and that's basically what it is. But it's got a shape, and it's got rigidity and form, and so it formed a rather natural tube for the air to flow down. You can see it being stitched in, and you see the top left there, a patch on the aorta. And he did remarkably well after that. Now, that patch was a product of a piece of work done by Klaus Herberhold in Bonn, who's an ENT surgeon, who was looking for a patch that would work in the tracheas of adults. And when you look at what happened to that patch, it's amazing. You could use it for anything, really. So it was pickled in formaldehyde for a couple of weeks, then thimerosal to dissolve the proteins on it, and then stored in acetone to take the fat away. And essentially, you've got a rigid, non-antigenic collagen skeleton. It's worth remembering. And we just stitched it in. I did with Jeff Jacobs, who was my senior vegetable at the time, and Klaus Herberhold, who's the ENT surgeon from Bonn. We did 33 children around the world, or mainly in the US and the UK. We operated on the three of us together. And there's a 60% 12-year survival with that funny leather patch to replace your airway. Now, that's a leather patch. How can it last that long? Well, the fascinating thing is that this patch gets a blood supply and re-epithelializes quite quickly, and on scanning EM, we were able to demonstrate that you get ciliated respiratory epithelium on the inside of your airway really quite quickly. Now, unfortunately, in November 2009, Kieran once again bled, and his stent, which you can see every now and again it recycling in his airway, there's the stent appearing here, and you can see there it erodes into his aorta. Now his mother resuscitated him again, and Kieran lives in Ireland, so how she kept him alive I don't know. We got him to hospital, and they kept him sedated in hospital, and just trickling the odd drop of blood out. Unfortunately, these homographs had fallen foul of the prion debate, and we were unable to use them. I got a fridge full of them and couldn't use them. So now what do we do? Well, we've been building tracheas in the lab from stem cell-based technologies, tissue engineering. So this is a donor trachea from a donor which is stripped of its donor cells and then marinated for some time with stem cells of various kinds until you can reconstitute it as a trachea like the recipient. And this we put into, members of our team anyway, have put this into a patient that you might have read about in the papers in Spain. And she had the lower end of her trachea replaced with a stem cell created trachea, and it did pretty well. But it was only a tiny section, it was just half an inch long, and it worked quite well. Now for Kieran, sadly there was no time for us to build the trachea in the lab because he was dying of bleeding. And it would have taken us, in the UK at least, another 6 months to complete all the regulatory and ethical framework that we had to go through for good manufacturing practice. So we took a shortcut to Plan B, which was an innovation. All this has been innovation, of course, but the innovation was based on sort of loose logic. So this is work done by Augustinus Bader in Leipzig. And on the left, you can see a bunch of injuries. This one is a donor skin graft site. This is a diabetic ulcer, and this is a varicose ulcer. Each of these two were being listed for amputation. And what Augustinus did was to take a gel mounted with stem cells and stimulated with a bunch of hormones, which I'll show you in a minute, and just lay them on the top and got healing. So he'd use the body as an in vivo bioreactor to change the function of those stem cells into the tissue that they wanted to be. So it's like a signaling mechanism to make the stem cells change into the cells, the target cells. Interestingly, avoiding amputation is quite a nice outcome for this large group of patients. So this is what we did with Kieran. On the day of the surgery, we had previously taken a trachea from a donor in Italy, matched for size and weight and all that stuff using CT scans, and we stripped all the donor cells from the trachea using a mixture of detergents and enzymes 25 times, flushing it down the trachea and irrigating it on the outside. And then that gets stored in a fridge at 4 degrees centigrade until we needed it. In the meantime, we had planned the operation that we were going to do with Kieran, and on the day of surgery we took bone marrow from his pelvis and respiratory epithelium and put those in a motorbike and took them up to the Royal Fleet, where there's a good manufacturing practice facility. And then that graft was prepared while I took out his trachea and repaired his aorta on circulatory arrest. And that took me the better part of 3 hours to do that bit. In the meantime, the graft was being prepared. It was injected with TGF-beta, which is supposed to convert stem cells into cartilage cells, and that was injected all the way around there. And then the stem cells themselves, which have got 37 million mesenchymal stem cells, were sprayed all over it and marinated. And then we added erythropoietin to it in order to stimulate a vascular supply, and lined the inside with some pieces of his respiratory epithelium. And that came back in a motorbike, and I was able then to stitch it back into his trachea quite successfully. He had some interesting problems. At 15 days, we'd stimulated his own stem cell production with GCSF, and unfortunately that produced way too many lymphocytes in his airways, and we had DNA nets which we couldn't suck out, and he had to have a bronchoscopy every 4 hours to remove all this DNA. But within 6 months he had a vascularized epithelium, and at 15 months it looked abnormal, or it doesn't project very well. And if you you can see here, hairy, ciliated respiratory cells within the 6 months that it took for those to grow. So, excuse me. So there he is, having had his trachea replaced, his whole trachea replaced. And he did quite well. 2 years later, he became the Irish Child of Courage, and he plays regularly in an Irish show band. Now, interestingly, he also appeared that same year in a textbook in a little panel of the future of medicine for GCSE biology, and above him was Obama giving a speech about why stem cells are important. So he was dead chuffed about that. The Pope flew him over to Italy last year to meet the Nobel Prize winners in stem cell biology. So he's had an interesting life. He's now grown another 20 centimetres, and we biopsied him last week. He has normal respiratory epithelium in his airway. Now, that's really interesting, because that technique of decellularization suddenly allows you to think, that's interesting. If we were to decellularize lung, for example, in a different way than the one we've done before, because you kind of think you'd have to flush the blood vessels through to decellularize it properly. But in fact, if you flush it through the trachea, it's much more effective. So in 9 cycles of flushing through the trachea, we can remove all the donor DNA from a sheep's lung, and now we're 85% repopulated those lungs with the recipient cells. In other words, we're not that far away, certainly within a decade, of transplanting donor lungs from one donor to another without needing any drugs for the recipient. It's quite exciting. And in the process of doing this, we had to do some tests with muscle, because we also grow diaphragm. And Paolo De Coppi, who I work with, is a terrific guy. Paolo transplanted some muscle from one one rabbit to another, and then transplanted that into a rat, and there was no rejection. So he's demonstrated that you can do muscle interspecies xenotransplantation. So if you go back to that graph there, I have to tell you that the second patient we did died, and out of 10 patients done worldwide with tracheal stem cell transplantation, there are only 2 patients alive. So is what we did originally as good or better? And really, we should be going back now to the lab, as we are doing, to say maybe the original leather graft is better than anything that we've ever done since. It's moved us on, and so using nanotechnology, Alex Safalian at UCL has now able to make a polymer on which human cells grow, into which they grow, and using 3D printing and rapid prototyping, which we've worked out with Red Bull, the Formula 1 team, we can print a trachea or any other organ, an ear or a nose, and then populate it with human cells for the recipient from the stem cell biology. So this is the edge of what's coming next, and I think one patient in each of the centres that have been doing this, one patient has driven the science and drives us back to the lab. So let me tell you about my risky process. How safe is medicine? Does anybody know this? These are high reliability organisations, assuming you fly here. Any idea where medicine is? It's there. Okay, every time, and that's not surviving your illness, that's us causing problems to the patient when they're coming in the hospital. It's a dangerous place. And for us, one of the most dangerous things I do as a cardiac surgeon, or used to do, is an arterial switch operation, where you move the coronary arteries of a newborn baby. That's just under 1 millimetre across that little hole at the bottom. And you have to move the coronaries from one artery to another. When you're operating on a child, you get to know all about them. They're in the operating room, you know their physiology, you're giving them a bunch of medicines and a bunch of fluids, everything's highly monitored. It's unbelievably dangerous, as you can see, because any of this stuff you can trip over. But if the baby is under there, and after 4, 5, 6 hours, you really understand that baby's physiology. And when you want to finish that operation, all I want to do usually is go to the pub. Had enough. But you've actually got to move that child along the corridor, disconnect it from the AC power supply, hand ventilate it so its physiology changes. You've got to move it, reconnect it at the other end, all of which carries a risk, and at the same time transfer all your innate knowledge about that baby to another team. They've got to grab what you're doing, even though they may well also prefer to be in the pub at 7 o'clock in the evening than doing that work. And it occurred to us that this, and by the way, this was proven to be one of the most dangerous parts of cardiac surgery, not the operation, not the surgeon, but the journey between the two places. And one Sunday morning, after we'd been doing that, we watched this in it was the Spanish Grand Prix, and the McLaren team, then those days, changed the tyres and refueled the car in 6.8 seconds. And it just looked awfully like what we were having trouble with, this most dangerous transition from one place to another, transferring hardware and software and a piece of information. So my colleague Alan Goldman, who's braver than I am, rang up McLaren there and then from the pit from on the Sunday, and got put bizarrely straight through to the pits in Spain. And on the Tuesday, Ron Dennis and his whole team came to Great Ormond Street to look at our process. And we asked if they can do it, why can't we? Well, when you look at what we were doing and what they do from above, you can immediately see the similarity. It's not very, very difficult to see why we came up with this parallel. And what's happening is that each of the people on the left-hand panel have their own job, their own task, and a reserved person with a hand. They don't get in each other's way. If somebody has a cardiac arrest in here tonight, I can guarantee that you will all go rushing to help them and no one will know who's in charge. And it's an absolutely nightmarish place to have a heart attack in a room full of doctors, by the way. Try and avoid it. Better on the tube. Not in an elevator though, that's bad. Anyway, the thing is that what we learnt was that you had to transfer leadership, ownership, knowledge, software, hardware in a certain order. And that you had to stand in a certain place, and the surgeon was peripheral to all of this. There's this tradition of surgical ownership of the patient, but actually if the surgeon says anything too early, this is a complete shamble. So we had a very strong, disciplined process where leadership was transferred from the anaesthetist through to the intensivist in a very formal way, using a written handover which was written down and then rewritten down. The equipment was connected up first, before anybody spoke. Then the anaesthetist handed over the information, and only finally did the surgeon speak and say, this is what we did and this is the plan for the next 24 hours. It involved leadership and choreography, and we had a ballet dancer from the Royal Ballet School teach us how to stand and how to move and how to stay quiet. And we needed that because none of us knew how to stand or be quiet or do anything, because we were all big-mouthed surgeons who just wanted to be in the way. You have to be disciplined in a team. You're functioning in a team, and you have to trust the other person and know what they're going to do. Now, after we'd done all this and did it, we essentially demonstrated a significant reduction in errors, omission. We got more efficient, 4 times reduction in multiple errors, which is a lot when you're working in a team like that. And we'd moved from poor number of errors to a good number of errors, and from ineffective to effective teamwork. We could not get this published. There are no molecules, there are no genes, there are no stem cells. No one was interested at all, until I gave a talk about this in New York at some other meeting or other, and there was a journalist at the back who went away and wrote about it, and the next day it was the front 3 pages of the Wall Street Journal. We had 80 million people read it, and Alan and I were invited to about a third of the Fortune 500 boardrooms within 2 weeks to go and talk about handover. Because when do you think the biggest risk is in any manufacturing industry? At handover, shift change. And we found a way of doing the obvious, which to us seemed just like, because we like red cars going around in circles, it seemed like an interesting thing to do. But it's a common thing in every industry, in every way you go. And this is reproducible and has been reproduced in every medical practice that's been involved with. Discipline of handover is what you guys are going to have to struggle with, because you're all going to be on shifts. I didn't have that problem because I was on all the time. And although that sounds like a pain in the ass, my job was much easier than your job. Much, much, much easier, because I knew every patient really well. And now you guys don't. And that continuity is a threat to them as well. So we learned 3 big lessons from them. That you have to rehearse what you do really, really carefully. They do rehearse at a table, thinking what could go wrong, and then working it out. The second big lesson is that they rehearse everything, and they practice, and they do it over again. And guess what the third lesson is? It's rehearsal. How many of you rehearse what you're going to do in medicine? I can tell you as a cardiac surgeon, I practice what I do on patients, but we don't sit down and rehearse that operation in advance very well. And certainly we don't debrief at the end of it in the same way that the Red Arrows would or the Formula One teams would. We're way off being a safety culture. We've got a long, long way to go. Incidentally, they do all this around a round table. Never have a meeting around a square table or an oblong table if you could avoid it, because someone will always try and lead. It's much better to be a round table where everybody is treated equally. Okay, so I'm just going to wind up with this bit, which is about why I think you've got a lot to do and how you can innovate. There has been an exponential, or is an exponential growth in spending on healthcare. And that's considerably higher than the growth in GDP, which is not a particularly great economic measure. Actually, I should ask Deborah about that. She understands these things. But the rise in expenditure in healthcare is massive. We spend about 8% of our GDP on healthcare. The Americans spend 18.4%. And as far as I know, they don't live twice as long. So there's some other noise going on in various systems about this. This has had a huge impact, that and the banking crisis, because there's not so much money to go around. And over the next decade, our government has promised us a 1.8% per year reduction in the amount I get paid for example, the arterial switch. For everything I do, we're going to get less. Not more. I can't put the prices up like because the market's changed like the energy companies. I know that my prices are going down. Now that's the internal inflation rate of 2.5% based on what you get for a pay rise and what you get for Agenda for Change. And that's the internal inflation rate based on the price of products being imported from Germany, America, China, or anywhere else. So that is a little gap of the savings we have to make to survive every year. Yeah? So this amounts, in our practice, to 7% savings per year, year on year, for the foreseeable decade. And that's the medicine that you're about to enter. It's not the medicine I entered, it's the medicine you're going to enter. So there is no money to go around. Everything that you see from now on is going to be about doing it differently. If you're a business making a loss like that, which is essentially what we are doing, if you're making a loss, you're functionally in turnaround. And turnaround's a state when you have to cut the costs to stop the cash drain. And most of us don't even get close to starting to think about that as doctors and nurses, because we just want to get up and operate on people and look after them, and quite rightly so. But it's not going to be like that. There's a brilliant article that John Appleby wrote in the BMJ, which you might miss if you weren't interested in this, which is that during the 2000s under the Labour government, we have fantastic growth in investment in healthcare, and that's now stopped after the banking crisis. And the best thing we can look forward to is zero terms real growth, and I've just shown you ours is actually going down. So if the demand and what we're expecting to do continues, there's going to be a gap between the cost and the demand and our productivity. And that you thought that was, you remember we were supposed to save 25 billion. The latest prediction is that we need to save 50 billion, that's 30 billion pounds more over the next decade. How many seconds is a million seconds? How long is a million seconds? Anybody know that? No, it's about 28 days, but you've got to go up to billions of seconds. It's a hell of a long time. The real graph here is this one, which I quite like. This is the productivity gain, annual productivity gain achieved from 1996 to 2010, and the size of that productivity gain in proportional terms is shown by the size of the circle. What you guys are going to have to do is this. Per year. Now, there isn't a single organisation, private or public, anywhere in the world that's ever achieved that. Right? But the money is not there, so something's going to change. Something's got to give. Appleby said it was undoable, but they're doing it anyway. They've just taken £2 billion yesterday out of London's budget. Now, let's look at that another way. This is cardiac surgery results in the UK over 3 years for tetralogy of Fallot. Pretty well everybody gets 100% survival. Right? Fantastic. Much better than the US results. But what's missing is cost and value. Now, why does that matter? Well, because value is the outcome divided by the cost. And if you're really looking at that properly, you will read the work of Michael Porter, who works at Harvard, who says that you really want to measure the benefit for patients and their outcome not just once, but over the course of life, divided by the cost of delivering those outcomes over life. So if I screw up somebody's brain doing their cardiac surgery operation, then the cost of the outcome is actually much higher than the operation itself, because I have to put the added inputs into getting them through school or the help they need when they grow up. Cost and value is something we're really familiar with. If you want to buy a Camry, you wander out to Jessop's, have a look at one, hold it, you then read a few camera books, then you ask your mates what they've got, and then you go to Amazon and buy it cheapest because it gets delivered the next day. You trust them, it always turns up and it works. Why can't the patient do that in the health service? Who's the best medical student in this room? I want to go to them. Who's the best cardiac surgeon in the country? I'd like to know. If it's my child, I want to look. I'm a doctor, I know who's good. So I'm going to send my child to that person. Why haven't you got that right? We need to get our data out there so that people can really make choices. And if you think about how the challenge for me is that, and why I talked about this as being a patient focus, is because most of the stuff we do is designed around us, particularly surgeons and anaesthetists. It's not designed about what the patients want. For my business, why on earth do I expect people with children to come and see me between the hours of 9 and 5? If I was John Lewis or a cinema or a restaurant, I'd be really pissed off if the restaurant was only open 9 till 5, wouldn't you? It'd be really bad to go down to Brixton Village and find the Honest Burgers shut. Wouldn't suit me at all. You want to identify what works for the patient and get rid of everything else, what adds value to them. If it doesn't add value to them, what's the point of it? And you've got to minimise the time to get through their treatment. So here's an example just to say what I mean. This is a thing called a time value chart. This is an old-fashioned test which nobody does anymore, but it makes the point. This is an INR done in a hospital. Now we do it at home with any luck. But this is very much like me having a blood test. I'm on methotrexate, so I recognise this story. Come in, you have your bloods taken, you turn up at UCL, you sit in a queue and wait for someone to take your blood. They send your blood to the laboratory. Who knows where the laboratory is? It goes off to the other end of town, and a result comes back, and then somebody sends for a doctor for you to talk to about it. And then at the end of that time, your dose is altered. Right? So now you've had 100% value added to what you wanted to do in 3 little bits. The blood test, the test itself, and then the doctor. Actually, those things only take 14 minutes, but I've been in UCL for 2 hours screwing around with my lunch hour. If you look at it from this side and look at it from the patient's value, anything horizontal is a waste of time. So when you want to add value to the life of your patients, look at it from their point of view, think about those horizontal lines and get rid of them. And then you've done something useful, and you've massively reduced the cost of what you do. And the trick here is to get the blood sample, the machine, and the doctor all in the same room at the same time. And you've solved it. And people have done that. We'll wind up talking about this guy. He's called Devi Shetty, works in Bangalore. He now does open heart surgery on children for $2,000. And the average in the US is between 20 and 100,000. It's about 50,000 in the UK for this kind of work. And with big economies of scale, he's made a big difference. So he, at this time, this was 2008, was doing twice as many operations per year as Boston Children's, and exactly the same number as we do in the whole of the UK. He was doing in one hospital. 42 were surgeons, start at 6 a.m., working days, 6 till midnight, and you just operate, and in shifts, because the patients need operations, so why are we not doing them? He has asked a question which I think is the most important one that we could face going into the next decade? What right have we got to think that it's okay to spend $100,000 on an operation when it can be done for $2,000? What right have we got to be in that space? It just isn't logical. So here's my challenge. We operate 8 o'clock till 6:30 every day and a half, Saturday as well. So if you work that out, we're only using our operating facilities for 34% of the time, 2/3 is unused. One day of not doing it. How can that be right? I think we've designed it for the offices. And the challenge I'm going to leave you with just now is that you have to make it right for the patients and the customers and put them right at the centre of your thinking. Because the way we're doing it at the moment is just wrong. And it's your generation that's going to have to innovate lots of little ways, little processes. And you're going to hear in just a minute from Jack that there are really good ways never to have to see a patient in outpatients, because that's a stupid cost that you usually don't need. Thank you very much.